Like and subscribe and you'll have amazing luck for the rest of the week. In today's video, we'll be talking about the weird, the terrible, and often scary things you can only find inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone. What do you think is the creepiest? Well, make sure to let us know down below in the comments. I've also noticed that most of you watching this aren't subscribed yet, so if you do like the video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's absolutely free and you can always change your mind later. With that said, enjoy the video. Number 10. Old ladies. Well, there's nothing inherently terrible about old ladies. What's terrible, though, is the level of radiation they have to endure for the sake of coming home. The Telegraph reports that the Soviet government evacuated 116,000 people after the Chernobyl accident, resetting most of them in apartments outside the exclusion zone. However, for some residents, especially of the smaller villages, leaving wasn't really on their minds. About 1,200 people known as self-settlers moved back into the exclusion zone in the months and years following the disaster. Most of them were over the age of 48, and of the handful that still survive today are about 80% female. These self-settlers do understand the risks. They know the soil is contaminated, but they still grow food in it anyway. They raise chickens and hogs, despite the real dangers of eating meat that's been raised in the exclusion zone. And despite most of them being in their 70s and 80s, they are miraculously relatively healthy. Number 9. Tourists. According to Newsweek, 12,000 tourists visit the exclusion zone every single year. You might ask yourself, why would anyone risk radiation exposure for a bit of fun? Well, because they can. And with the right precautions, it's actually relatively safe. Relatively being the key word. Hotels in the area request that you leave your radioactive shoes outside. However, it's unclear whether the tour company, the one responsible for bringing tourists into the exclusion zone, also has nuclear waste disposal services. This is a given because you wouldn't want to really be keeping any potential contaminated clothing with you. These tour outfits do promise that you won't turn into a radioactive mutant during one of these tours. Dosimeters rarely read high during a tour. In fact, according to Newsweek, the highest reading is similar to what you might get on a round-trip flight from San Francisco to Paris. Still, there are risks in going on one of these tours, but the attraction is kinda hard to deny. Plus, funnily enough, an 11-hour excursion into Pripyat is surprisingly cheap, about the cost of a 2-day ticket to Disneyland, and arguably has better sights. Number 8. A giant sarcophagus. The giant sarcophagus was built to do one thing and one thing only, and that's to contain the radiation-spewing monster that is the failed nuclear reactor and all the deadly radiation that it still produces. This massive structure is the largest ever object moved by humans and was made from 14 million cubic feet of concrete and just over 8,000 tons of metal. Before containing the deadly terror within its thick walls, its makers faced the daunting task of building it. According to the BBC, workers assembled the original sarcophagus in shifts, lasting 5 to 7 minutes each because longer shifts might have actually killed them instantly instead of resigning them to a long, painful, cancer-ridden death much later in life. The original sarcophagus was a complete failure, hence the mutated animals that we talk about later today. It took 20 years for engineers to come up with a solution. When the new sarcophagus was finally complete, the builders needed 18 ships and 2,500 trucks to actually move it and all of its parts from Italy to Chernobyl. It was finally installed in November 2016, and it now stands over the ruined reactor, a giant bane to visitors who were hoping to break into the much less secure, older version of the sarcophagus to take pictures of creepy dolls. Oh, and speaking of creepy dolls, of course, Number 7. Creepy dolls and lots of them. Pripyat is full of old, broken dolls. So many, in fact, that people who go there are given some kind of weird horror movie vibe, especially in and around the vicinity of the sarcophagus. Wherever you go in Pripyat, one thing is a guarantee. There will always be creepy dolls staring at you. They sit on windowsills, up on skeletal bed frames, they're sprawled out in piles of debris, and some of them are even wearing gas masks. Contrary to what you might think, the former residents didn't arrange the dolls this way just before they were evacuated. According to the International Business Times, tourists are responsible for this macabre scene, rearranging the dolls to up the creep factor of their photos to the maximum. There are even some dolls who look relatively brand new, suggesting that even these dolls were brought in by tourists. It's a very weird practice, but being a tourist myself, it perfectly does make sense. Number 6. The Gas Mask Room. Within the exclusion zone, a building called Middle School Number 3 contains the most photographed collection of gas masks in all of Pripyat. One of the rooms in this dilapidated building is practically carpeted with gas masks, and of course there's also a gas mask wearing doll propped on a stool in the middle of the room. This is because it's Pripyat and this place is a thing for creepy dolls, as you may have noticed. The scene makes you imagine a scenario where panicked residents were so hastily evacuated that they didn't have time to don their masks. They were just kinda left, strewn about there. However, as in most cases, the truth is not that dramatic. At the time of the accident, most of the masks were in storage and were probably never taken out by anyone who worked there or attended middle school number 3. They were most likely removed months or years later. All of the mask filters are gone, which were likely removed by looters hoping to salvage the small amount of silver inside, which actually does give me the shuddering thought that someone out there is probably eating with some radioactive silverware. Number 5. The Abandoned Carnival. Not a lot of people know that the Pripyat amusement park was not yet finished on the day of the meltdown, and so it's never actually officially opened. It was actually scheduled to open 5 days later on May Day, May 1st. Today the park stands as an abandoned icon of the Chernobyl disaster and a stark reminder of all that could have been. Many Soviet cities had similar amusement parks dubbed parks of culture and rest, and some are even open to this very day. Unfortunately, Pripyat's amusement park never did get to amuse the masses. It did, however, briefly open to the public on April 27th, just a few hours before evacuation orders were issued later that day. The park was far from ready to receive patrons, but residents were excited to get a chance to visit the fairgrounds. On top of that, most of the rides weren't even in service yet, but they were happy regardless. Today, the park is one of the creepiest places on Earth. The bumper cars sit abandoned, the Ferris wheel frozen in place, and with its paint chipping and fading as well. The paint on the yellow canopies is still bright in spots, giving today's visitors a glimpse of what could have been. Number 4. The Bloody Red Forest. The Bloody Red Forest is a set of woodland where all the pine trees turned a blood red color right after the meltdown, and then died not long after. The most terrifying aspect of the Bloody Red Forest is that even after decades after the catastrophe, these trees are not decaying, when most rotten to dust within a decade after being on the ground. Kinda like vampires, dead yet undying at the same time, just trees. Of course, scientists ran some tests by filling specially prepared garbage bags with leaf litter from uncontaminated areas, taking care that there were no insects or decomposers present, and then leaving the bags out in both contaminated and uncontaminated wooded areas in the exclusion zone for nearly a year. They then checked the decomposition rates of the leaves and found that the bags outside the exclusion zone decomposed normally, but the ones inside decomposed at a much slower rate. The results suggest that the radiation exposure has had a detrimental effect on the ability of the Chernobyl ecosystem to replenish itself with nutrients. This in turn is most likely the cause of the stunted tree growth. These non-composing dry leaves also are fire hazards and have actually caused forest fires in the area, which actually release more radiation than the surrounding areas, making an already dangerous place even deadlier. Number 3. The Shadows of the Residents. I'm pretty sure you've seen the macabre photos of the so-called shadows of people left on walls of buildings and streets of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These shadows are all that's left of the people who were instantly killed and vaporized by the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on the cities. Pripyat also has these shadows, but they weren't created by a nuclear explosion, but rather by some dark graffiti artists, mostly coming from Belarus and Germany. In one room, a little girl with bows in her pigtails reaches for a light switch. Outside, a boy pulls a toy truck toward the corner of a building. On other walls, there are people who appear to be dancing. And then in another, there are 3 children who are jumping, or maybe even floating, holding on to each other in either joy or terror. Number 2. Radiation-eating fungi. As cliché as it may sound, life does find a way, even in what seems to be a non-survivable situation. In 2002, scientists discovered fungus growing inside the damaged 4th reactor, where radiation levels are still extraordinarily high. Finding life in the deadliest of kill zones is astonishing enough, but what's really mind-blowing is the fact that these organisms seem to thrive in that highly radioactive environment. In fact, it looks like that they're feeding on the radiation itself. Discovering an organism that can actually neutralize radiation by eating it has a lot of practical applications, and that's the reason why samples of this fungus were sent to space, specifically to the International Space Station. At the ISS, the danger of radiation exposure is always a possibility. The experiments on the ISS revealed that the fungus was utilizing melanin to transform radioactive gamma rays into chemical energy, and that this ability may turn out to be useful in future space exploration. They're hoping that the fungus may be used to both shield equipment and the crew from deadly radiation during long space flights. Even more importantly, it can help clean up radioactive waste. Now it's time for the day's best pick. So if you find something creepy online and want to know more about it, send it on over to us and we'll look into it for you. Who knows, might even feature in a future video. With that said, number 1. Mutated animals. I'm pretty sure that this question has popped into your minds while watching this video. Did the radiation from Chernobyl create mutant animals like in Fallout, Stalker, and Chernobylite? Well, the short answer is yes, but you'll be hard-pressed to find 4 giant turtles named after Renaissance painters here. Scientists around the world were completely surprised to find that the wildlife in the exclusion zone came back much sooner than they thought, and all things considering, they're doing pretty well. However, what didn't surprise them were the effects of the radiation, and not all of them were spared. Both wild animals and the domestic ones left behind were affected, having been born with major birth defects such as multiple heads, muzzles, and legs. They also found other defects, such as a cat with 2 faces, a lamb with 8 legs, a 2-faced calf, and another calf with legs growing from its back. And that's our video for the day, folks. Thanks for sticking with me till the end. Like the video if you do, and leave a comment. Also, make sure to check out the channel's other amazing content. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Later, everybody.